This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Tom Swarbrick.
Very good morning to you. It has just gone midnight on Friday, the 22nd of January. You are listening to Late Nights with Tom Swarbrick here on LBC. If you just joined the show, a very warm welcome to you. And, of course, welcome to you wherever it is you are listening to us tonight around the UK or the world. Always good to have your company. As you know, on Thursday's show, we, as the home of the future, usher in something in our lives that is going to change, that is going to have to be dealt with over the coming years to get ahead of the curve, to really get ahead of the game. If you've been following this over the last few months and weeks, we've talked about technology, we've talked about AI, we've talked about all kinds of things. We've talked about humans' ability to become an interplanetary species, for crying out loud. You know, everything. We do everything on the home of the future. And one of the things that I thought we'd touch on tonight is related to what we saw happen this week. President Biden has now signed the US back into the Paris Climate Accord, meaning that global action with the global leader in the United States can now begin to happen again, particularly as fears around what climate change is doing to our, not just the sort of the health of our planet, but also to us as humans, grows again. The UK is hosting COP26 this year. This is the climate summit, which have huge expectations on them, not least for President Biden, but huge expectations from an awful lot of sources. And in discussing climate change, we always talk, I think, mainly about, obviously, the impact on the environment itself, trees, animals, that kind of thing, the impact on economies, the impact on our ability to keep going at the speed at which we're going when it comes to flights or cars or oil consumption, all those kind of things. One aspect of it that hasn't been touched on all that much is the issue of climate migrants. Those are people who have been forced out of where they're living because of climate change. And I think, to be honest, that is the area where you see instantly the impact of something that might feel a bit far away, might feel a bit sort of ethereal, might feel a bit sort of over there, when perhaps our understanding of climate change is we have a few more floods every year. We're not getting the 50-degree heat. We're not getting the forest fires. But meanwhile, over in places like Bangladesh and Indonesia, they are literally having to move capital cities in order to avoid being destroyed by rising sea levels. And that is meaning that there are people who are moving with them. And there is a fear that over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which are going to become hotter, harder for crops to grow, harder to rear animals in order to eat and to sell, the people are going to move north. They're going to move for greater opportunities. They're going to move to try and protect themselves. And we are going to see mass climate migration over the course of the coming few decades. And I just wanted to touch on that tonight and see how far we got with that issue and what could be done to try and prevent it. 0345 6060 973 is the number. If you have any questions on any aspect of this, not just the climate migration problem, but any aspect of climate change as well. We'll come to your calls in a few moments. I'm delighted to say we are joined tonight by Kelsey Norman, who is the director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Programme at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. She is also the author of the book Reluctant Reception. Thank you so much for coming on the programme tonight. Really good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start at the the top of this. What are climate migrants and who are climate migrants?
Sure. So this is a really loose term that doesn't have much legal impact now because there is no agreed upon definition of what a climate migrant would or should be. So a lot of people talk especially about climate refugees, which again isn't, as you sort of implied in the introduction, this could come to mean someone who is forced to leave their home country because of ongoing issues related to climate change, whether it's being forced out of their homes or having to, the impact of things like civil wars that are instigated by changing environments, by people having to move around within their countries. But it's not something that's agreed upon in law, and it's certainly not something that's, someone can't leave their country, seek asylum in another country on the basis of having left because of climate change. So that doesn't exist yet, but there is lots of discussion around whether it should exist.
Is it happening now? are people being forced to leave where they lived previously because of climatic natural disaster events?
This is another really good question that doesn't have a definitive answer because it's not clear. People leave their homes for all sorts of reasons, right? And it's hard to pinpoint exactly how climate change is impacting migration and might be impacting someone who actually successfully leaves their home. But what we do know is that it's really hard to leave your home country, right? So the number of refugees in the world, whilst large in comparison to what it has been historically, is actually quite small in terms of the number of, when you look at the number of internally displaced people, for example. So there's about 80 million internally displaced people within the world versus 20 million refugees. So those are people that have successfully left their home countries.
Yeah. And the distinction is worth making between a refugee and a displaced person. And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Kelsey, but as I understand it, there are now more displaced people around the world than at any point in human history.
Correct. Yes. And so I think what a lot of people are seeing is that in terms of climate change migration and the pressures that puts on people, whether it's having to leave, as you said, areas that are close to oceans and thus going to be impacted by rising sea levels, those people are much more likely to flee to urban environments within their own home countries than they are to actually successfully leave those countries. Because it's really hard to leave your country. You need resources, you need networks, you need the ability oftentimes to, get a visa to be able to leave. So sometimes people leave irregularly without, proper access to being able to enter another country. But just because you want to leave your home country doesn't give you the legal right to then enter another.
We talked too about climate change having an impact on resources in particular countries. If crops don't grow, you can't feed people. And I wonder how that works, how that relates to populations that are set to increase dramatically over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. Again, in sub-Saharan Africa, populations are set to explode over the course of the next few decades. Those two things can't coexist all that easily, can they?
Right. And you can imagine, so then if people are forced to leave more rural areas where they might be involved in agriculture, that's going to put a lot of pressure on cities that are already strapped for resources, access to healthcare, access to housing, access to schools, access to jobs. All these things will even, have even more pressure than they currently do in underdeveloped countries. So people that do have the resources might consider trying to leave and fleeing their countries, attempting to go to other places, maybe in the global north. But again, the reality is that it's become really hard to leave your own home country, harder than it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. So countries like the US, countries like the UK are making it increasingly difficult for people to actually get to their countries to seek asylum. So again, it's questionable, I think, whether because of climate change, whether we'll see more and more people arriving in the global north. I think what we're actually more likely to see is more and more refugees in countries of the global south.
Yes.
Other underdeveloped countries.
And at the moment, again, I've got this wrong, but the largest refugee camp contains, is it millions of people? And it's in Africa. I think is it in Sudan or Somalia?
Kenya, I believe. If those numbers are still the largest, the Dadaab refugee camp is the largest in Kenya. Yeah. Turkey is the host of the largest numbers of refugees in terms of, not necessarily in camps, but just in terms of the total number of refugees living in any country. Yeah. So most of these countries are countries of the global south, right, who do predominantly the most amount of work in terms of hosting refugees. So whether it's caused by the climate, drying up of resources, places becoming inhabitable, whether it's war, whether it's disease, whatever it is, more people are moving around the world, and yet it is becoming harder for those people who are moving around the world typically to get into places like the UK and the US. Do you think that trend is set to continue? That because of perhaps political pressure, countries like the UK and US are only going to make it more difficult? I absolutely think that's correct. So my book looks at this, but I think we can just look at recent news examples, right? So under the presidency of former President Donald Trump, in the U.S. example, he sought out all these types of agreements with third countries like Mexico, Guatemala, other countries that you might think of, well, they actually send migrants, but they also receive refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, right? So he sought out these agreements whereby anyone who tries to come to the U.S. could actually be sent back to those other countries, those developing countries, and would have to seek asylum there. And in the UK, your government is also talking about looking for these types of policies, right? To come up with safe third country agreements so that people trying to arrive in the UK could instead be sent back to other countries. And of course, those countries would be developing countries.
And if there's a blockage in the pipeline of people who want to get into countries like the UK, like the US, into Europe, what we saw in, was it 2015 now? It feels like a lifetime ago, were millions of people leaving the Middle East, coming through Europe, and we know what happened when Angela Merkel accepted 1 million of them into Germany. Again, it strikes me that is going to become almost a regular thing.
It could be, but I think that countries in Europe are doing everything they can to make sure that it doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
But I think the danger in that, so in that time period, there were about 1 million Syrians in particular that arrived in Europe, right? In that same time period, millions, so multiple millions, were being hosted in countries like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, right, of Syrians in particular. So if Europe had kind of managed to sort out some kind of scheme to continue hosting or to, divide amongst itself places for those individuals arriving in Europe to actually, live, as opposed to seeking out a policy where people would be potentially returned back to a country like Turkey, I think we would have seen everything play out quite differently. So now, instead of coming to this political arrangement amongst European countries, we have Europe looking for every possible way through which it can prevent people from ever getting to Europe in the first place. And think about that pressure that puts on countries in the Middle East, North Africa, or countries even sub-Saharan Africa to host refugees and migrants themselves, leaving these people in very precarious situations whereby maybe they don't want to stay there. So they're going to continue to look for routes to come to Europe or to come to other countries.
There are so many questions to ask. Fortunately, we've got you until 1 o'clock. Kelsey Norman, you're Director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Programme at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. Her book is The Reluctant Reception. 0345 6060 973 is my number on any aspect of the migration that is going to come, the causes of it, whether it is war or disease or famine or indeed climate crisis. What should Europe, what should the UK, what should the West's position be, given that it looks more likely that it is us that is going to be the people that are going to be the countries that people want to come to escape whatever it is that is happening in their own part of the world. 0345 6060 973. Your calls after this. Tom Swarbrick here, 1216.
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's the home of the future on LBC. Tonight we're looking at the future of migration, given that everything we're seeing when it comes to the Paris Climate Accord that President Biden has now this week signed the US back into, major concerns about the impact of the climate crisis on migration, given that some places across the planet may well become uninhabitable in the not too distant future. And we're joined tonight by Kelsey Norman, Director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Programme at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. I want you to get your questions to her if you can. 0345 6060 973 is the number on any aspect of this, not just whether it's the climate crisis, but what the UK, US, West policy should be, how we should deal with the increasing numbers of people who are going to want to come here to better their lives, which is, I think, something that the vast majority of people should be able to understand, that you just want a better life. Let's kick off. Morris is in Peterborough tonight. Morris.
Tom, good evening, and good morning, and Kelsey, good morning.
Good morning.
I just wonder if you think that the media and mobile phones and internet are fueling the desires of all of these people who want to emigrate and come to the West. Do you not think the media has sort of stoked up their ambitions in some sort of way?
That's such an interesting question. I think that it does make a difference that more and more people globally can access informational resources. I don't know if it's so much about the media making incentivizing people to want to move. I do think that the access to social media or to connecting with other people who might have moved prior to them, and the speed at which they can do that might facilitate some knowledge and might potentially help people understand what is possible, what is not possible, what laws and restrictions are in place. So if anything, I think that the facilitation of information is probably a good thing for people, having people assess whether a journey might even be possible. So I think it could also go the opposite direction, that people might learn that it's quite difficult to migrate or to actually make it to a country like the UK or the US. So I think that the informational sharing is a good thing. The one thing I would add about media, though, is that, I think that the discussion about climate change fueled migration actually has, in both the cases of sort of more liberal leaning media and more conservative leaning media, I think it kind of stokes fear about what the future of refugees and climate journey might even be possible. So I think it could also go the opposite direction, that people might learn that it's quite difficult to migrate or to actually make it to a country like the UK or the US. So I think that the informational sharing is a good thing. The one thing I would add about media, though, is that, I think that the discussion about climate change fueled migration actually has, in both the cases of sort of more liberal leaning media and more conservative leaning media, I think it kind of stokes fear about what the future of refugees and climate change driven migration could look like. I don't think that we know that there's going to be suddenly, 200 million climate change refugees seeking access to countries in the global north in, however many years, 10, 20, 30 years, you see all these projections. I think that in a lot of cases, the liberal-driven media wants that to be the case because they want to stoke this fear about the impact of climate change and the fact that we need to address it. And conservative media wants to kind of push the security-driven agenda that, helping drive fear about this issue, about the possibility of climate change fueled migration, helps support the idea of, we need to implement all these types of security measures to keep people from coming here. So I think as consumers of media, we just need to be really critical about, wherever we're getting our media from, we need to really think, are those numbers going to look like that? Do we really think that there's going to be that many climate change driven or, refugees or migrants coming here? And why do we think that they're going to be coming here and not like a neighboring country more closer by?
Morris, what's your view?
Well, I'll be 77 in April if I live that long, and I don't disabuse the climate change philosophy at all. I just seriously wonder why the UK should be the target point for seemingly all external migrants. I just don't understand it.
Do you think it is?
Well, I think it's demonstrably, because they seem to travel through the rest of Europe, finishing up in Calais or along the French coast and aiming to get here.
Yeah.
And it is a constant flow. And I just don't understand the philosophy behind it. And
well, I think I'll ask Kelsey in a moment.
If they're all impoverished, how are they getting the information that they're getting through?
I see.
Most of them seem to have mobile phones.
Well, let's ask that. That's a good. It's a good question. Who are the kinds of people, Kelsey, from your experience and your understanding of it? Who are the kinds of people who are able to go from Syria in boats to Turkey or Greece and then up through Greece and Italy and Germany and France and then end up in Calais trying to come to the UK? Who are the people who do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Morris. So, it's interesting within migration, once you kind of look more closely at where people are coming from, who they are within their countries, you see that it's really not the poorest of the poor coming from developed countries who are able to actually leave those countries, whether they're leaving for more economically driven reasons or because of civil war or because of fight, whatever the reason, it's usually people that have some resources. So that's why you see people able to do things like purchase phones or, get information or make voyages, right? Just getting on just being able to...
It costs to get on the boats. It costs like thousands of pounds.
If you're going to hire a smuggler, it's at least, 5,000 euros or more. So it's generally not the poorest of the poor. It's people that have some resources. In terms of why people are coming to the UK, it's really interesting. If you look at the numbers since the beginning of the pandemic, it's actually the number of total asylum applications in the UK has gone down. But you are right that there are an increase in number of people traveling by boat from the north coast of France to the UK. It's not a lot. I mean, when you put it in the perspective of, populations and the UK population, it's about 8,000, I believe, have come within this last year. So it's actually not, a huge number, but it is certainly, people see it as threatening because it's not controlled migration. It's not migration that the state has given permission to them to come. So I understand the sort of threat and how that is then perceived in the media and amongst viewers.
And I do want to ask another question about that in just a moment, Kelsey, actually, when it comes to the methods by which people could legitimately come into the country, into the UK, without having to seek a dinghy and to get across the channel into it. Maurice, thank you. Good questions. Andrew's in Acton tonight. Andrew.
Hi. Tom, sorry, I'm just going to get you off speaker.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's this. For years, I've had this thought in my mind. Look, you probably remember that lovely old poem, we're all children of the universe, we have a right to be here. What I can't get my head around is, why should humans not just be free to go wherever they want in the world? Why do we need immigration controls? Why, all this hang-up about, no, you can't come here, you can't come here. Why? Is it really essential?
Oh, Andrew, I love your idealism.
Let me just
go on. Make the point.
Because think of it like water. People are not going to want to go where there are too many people. So, it will all spread itself around. If only people could be persuaded to allow freedom, then there would be a disincentive to go to places where it's overcrowded. There would be an incentive to go to places where it's free. And otherwise we have this business where we've got these borders, we've got these rules, and it is so...
All right. Well, listen. Let me put it together. I'll be interested to see what Kelsey says. Andrew, I'll leave you to your garlands of daisies and your singing of Kumbaya. But Kelsey, your thoughts on why we just can't, open it all up?
No, I love your question, Andrew, and I would invite you to check out some of the scholarly literature on this, because it's so interesting. Political theorists have thought about this and really question, what is it? Why, if we were to open the borders, would everyone go? And a lot of people argue that if that were the case, they wouldn't, because people have attachments to their home. If you look at global migration currently, and granted, as you acknowledge, there are all these border controls in place, but only 3% of the world's inhabitants leave their country of origin. So only 3% of the world's population are migrants. It's pretty small, right? And that's stayed pretty consistent over time. As the population of the world has grown, of course, we see more migrants, but as a percentage, it's pretty much stayed the same. And those are people, a lot of them, who have the opportunity to leave, but they don't because they like their home country, right? So if we play the thought experiment through and we were to open up the borders, I think that you might see an initial sort of, not I won't say rush, but some impetus of people leaving and wanting to go to another place, maybe for better opportunities, maybe for educational opportunities, who knows. But then I think there would be this sort of settling out of people. Maybe they wouldn't feel so compelled to have to leave if that opportunity was more readily available to them. But it's an interesting thought experiment, Andrew, and I really like the question that you think about.
The reality, though, to come back to cynical old me again, the reality, though, is that if you've got areas of the world where there is, for instance, horrific famine or horrific war, as we've seen in Syria, you could have entire populations upping and leaving and going to other nations without there being, and you talked earlier about sort of controlled migration, without there being that degree of control that I think that people are at the moment, maybe they'll change over the course of the next 25, 30 years, at the moment people seek.
It's true. But I mean, even if you look at Syria, right? So this is a country that's been enveloped in civil war for almost a decade now. And granted, it's not so easy to leave Syria, but in the initial days, it was relatively easier. So it was possible to go to countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, because those countries were inviting, they understood the situation and they were offering relatively open borders at that point. It's not so easy now, but people are still leaving. Anyway, most people didn't leave, right? I mean, even a country where there was this threatening and dangerous situation, Syrians love their home. Syria is an amazing country, has an amazing history, has an amazing culture. People don't necessarily want to leave, and it's a really difficult choice actually to leave. Do you leave your family? Do you leave your friends? Do you leave your house? Do you leave your job?
Millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey, millions in Lebanon.
But there are tens of millions still inside the country, right? So we tend to focus on those who leave as opposed to those who maybe choose to stay. And that's a very difficult situation. Not every country is Syria, so not every country is enveloped in civil war. And so I think the fear that we have of this overwhelming mass flow of migration is not necessarily justified if we were ever to actually play out Andrew's question in reality.
Andrew, it's a good question. Sorry for taking the mic. Thank you for your call. 0345 6060 973 is the number. 84850 to text. You can, of course, tweet LBC. I do want to come back to the specific issue around the UK in a few moments' time as well. Kelsey Norman is with us, Director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Programme at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. Her book is called Reluctant Reception. You're listening to the Home of the Future on LBC. Tom Swarbrick here, 12:30. Here's Rachel Gerrish.
This is LBC with Tom Swarbrick. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
12:34, Home of the Future. Here's PJ in Cornwall. Tom, whatever the case, Brits should be proud to acknowledge the UK as a prime destination for immigrants, not puzzled and confused. I would agree with you. I think it's obvious to me why people would seek to want to come here to better their lives. It's because this is, by global standards, a great place to live. Saeed's in Cricklewood tonight. Saeed.
Hello. Hi, Kelsey.
Hello.
Hi. So the previous caller raised a really interesting point about why can't they move so easily, and you addressed the point about the migrants tend to not want to leave their homes because they love where they live and they want to leave for a better life. So that leads on to my point. And the way I look at it is that if you look in the last 100, 200 years, you have the Western powers who colonized Africa, Asia, and some of these people see British or American or countries like Belgium, France as their masters, and they see that you have a better life and not opportunity in those countries. That's the first thing. And the other thing was that you look at a lot of the wars around the world. I don't want to get into political discussion, but you see Western superpowers meddling in to those wars and funding some of those wars. So naturally, we should be allowing them into our countries, and people shouldn't complain because they come in, they work hard, they work long hours, they do jobs that local people don't want to do. They contribute to our economy. Yes, they may not adhere to all the laws, but I can tell you from my experience, Kelsey, growing up where I am now, we never used to have Afghani refugees. Now they're everywhere. And I have no problem with that.
But Saeed, your argument strikes me as it comes first from a kind of moral imperative, given the history of Britain and other nations, as opposed to what might be economic benefits. That the moral imperative to allow people to come in pretty freely is primary.
Yeah, I guess so. But at the same time, with climate change now and flooding happening in countries like Bangladesh, and you've got extreme wars going on in Syria, which Western powers have meddled in. You've got wars that happen in Libya. You've had wars that happened in parts of Africa, and you had the French who went there, the Belgians who went there. In Morocco, you got Moroccans who tend to want to go to France because the French were there. So what I'm saying is, coupled with climate change, which is a really good point, as well as the moral argument, why do Western governments resent this influx of people coming in when historically we went there and did what we wanted to do in their countries?
Let's see. Kelsey, thoughts?
Yes, I think you raise really excellent points. I'm going to kind of approach two, because I think you're talking about sort of in some ways two slightly different things. So I think you're talking about the as you said, the moral imperative of former colonial powers towards their former colonies and the inhabitants thereof. And oftentimes there are migration agreements that reflect that, right? Like it's easier for Moroccans or Algerians. It's easier than some other countries for those people to travel, for those individuals to travel to France, for example. But it's still not so easy. It still is. You have to apply for a visa. You have to have a certain sort of wealth status and all these other requirements. So I think you're right. I think there is a moral imperative, and it should be perhaps a bit easier for people. And I think I am of the persuasion that if there were more regular pathways for people to travel on for work employment, work opportunities, student visas, etc., that maybe we wouldn't see quite as much irregular migration as we do. And so I think that opening up pathways could help with some of the threat that states like the UK or France or others, or the US, feel towards those migrants or asylum seekers who travel via irregular pathways. So I think you're right in pointing out this moral imperative of especially former colonial powers. The other issue, though, I want to say is that in terms of refugees, because that is sort of a special category in terms of international law, in terms of how states consider them. And I think there's absolutely a moral imperative to resettle refugees. So these are not asylum seekers. These are not people who are ending up in a country like the UK and then applying for asylum. These are people who end up in usually like a third country, like a neighboring country to Syria, for example, Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. So it's up to other states, wealthy, powerful states like the UK, like the US, to resettle at least some of those people to sort of help out countries that are hosting the majority of refugees, right? So in the US, for example, we've really shirked our responsibility towards refugees over these past 4 years under the Trump administration. And we hope that now the Biden administration will sort of pick up that issue and we'll see more resettlement going forward, because the reason refugee resettlement exists as a concept, and the reason the entire refugee concept exists, is because it came out of World War II as a result of the Holocaust. I mean, that is the heart of it. That is, it was a travesty. It was a global travesty that happened when those who were persecuted under the Nazi regime attempted to flee and were not able to, and were thus condemned to live in that regime.
Listen, I think it is the notion of responsibility of wealthier, safer nations to look after refugees comes in a variety of forms. I mean, the UK government would say that the UK has given more money than any other nation to help in dealing with the resettlement of refugees from the Syria crisis. But what it strikes me you're talking about, Kelsey, is a greater responsibility than that. It is literally perhaps resettling many tens of thousands more than the UK has done already, although it's reached 20,000 now, in the UK itself. And I just wonder, practically, with the sort of political attitudes that there are at the moment, how might that work? What might that look like?
I don't want to fearmonger, and I know people are going to hear tens of thousands, and that's far too many, and that's too much. I think we can do this gradually. I think we can work up to whatever country feels competent with. But I think in the US, for example, I hope that we can really rescale that number. So we got, at the last year of the Biden administration, we were up at 120,000 resettled refugees that year. The ceiling was lowered down to, I think it was 14,000 last year. So that is a drastic drop. So I know as the US, we can certainly do more. And I'm not going to speak for the UK. I'm not a citizen, but I suspect that wealthy countries can do a bit more in that area as well. And I think that it's you have to think about it as a global good, right? Yeah. So the ability to resettle is something that I do think global North states have, and I think it helps relieve the burden on these countries in the South that are doing so much with few resources.
But what people say is, well, if that's something that you want and you think we should do, you have them live with you. I mean, during the whole Syria crisis thing, people were saying, well, if you want them to come here, you have them in your house, you look after them, you deal with them. Yeah. What's your response to that?
There was this political bantering between countries in Europe, especially in 2015, and no one could agree on anything. So instead, we said before, we ended up with all these agreements with other countries, right? The EU-Turkey deal, the deal with Libya. Now, countries with basically any other, name a country in the Mediterranean, and I think Europe has a deal with it in regards to those other countries hosting people as opposed to them coming to Europe. And this is what my book focuses on, and it is not a sustainable situation, is what I'm telling you. So if you want there to be less sort of irregular migration, less instability in terms of this issue of the presence of refugees, Europe has to pull its weight. And I think in the US as well. So this is not just me coming from North America.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
This, but global North states have to do a bit more because they can.
The book, by the way, is called Reluctant Reception. Syed, thank you. Marwan's in Cardiff tonight. Marwan.
Good morning. So my question essentially is, given that these crises affect everyone of any walks of life within a specific geographical area, it should be fair to assume that many millionaires and billionaires also enter the UK through that route. Is there any evidence that any country accepting refugees or by any other program is experiencing a net loss financially? Because, there's also a lot of wealthy people who are coming through these programs.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. I think that's a great question. I don't want to speak. This is a really touchy issue, I'm going to say. So I know, for example, in a country like Lebanon, which there's, a great debate over whether this has been a burden for Lebanon or a boon. Right. So the government doesn't want to hear that it's been a boon. It wants to hear that it's been really difficult. The government has expended so many state resources to assist people, to allow international organizations to come in and help them with some things. But, the government has done so much on its own, and it's a huge drain on, infrastructure, on name it, water, sewage, et cetera. Other NGOs and academic institutions have come out with reports saying that actually there's been a lot of positive value. So Syrian entrepreneurs have come in, they've started businesses. There's been all sorts of foreign aid that has come into the country as a result of hosting Syrians. That's also benefited Lebanese nationals and the government. So, and I think, this Lebanon is not unique in this. It's playing out across every country. So I think you're going to get different answers from the respective parties that you're looking at. I am of the mindset that there are all sorts of positive benefits. And I think, though, there is a danger as well in framing refugees as a possible economic boon. So, we like to talk about refugees can be a resource. They can provide all sorts of things. They can provide, economic benefits to a state or education. They bring their educational capital with them. And I think that can be true, but I don't think that's the reason that we should host refugees. I think that we host refugees because they are people who are being persecuted or they are people in need of protection, and that ultimately states have responsibilities to those people, whether we're talking about countries like the UK or the US or countries in the developing world as well.
Marwan, good question. Thank you for it. So many people want to get on tonight. 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll come to as many of your questions as we can before the news at 1. Keep them coming. Tom Swarbrick here. It's 12:45.
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Talks about the economic impact of migration, the moral imperative for or against more or less migration. Bob in Beaconsfield has a good question on another aspect of this. Hi, Bob.
Hi there.
Sir, your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask your guest how important she felt it was that we start exporting and displaying some of our values to the rest of the world so that we preempt any potential culture clashes once people start to come in and we start mixing more. So I remember speaking to you about this situation whilst I was working for an NGO in Sweden, and I remember you being quite shocked when I told you that I was discouraging people from coming to Britain because I didn't think it was necessarily in their best interest to come to some places that they weren't welcome. And I remember you being appalled. But then another thing that I was quite surprised at in Sweden is how they accepted a lot of people. And whilst I was teaching them English, Swedish and German before we knew where they were going to be sent, how little emphasis there was to actually impart Swedish values to the people that were coming in. And me being on the front line, meeting these people, obviously I was there to do a job, but I was quite surprised that as much as everyone dresses the same now and everyone knows who the same music artists are, they didn't have any idea as to our, or Sweden's, cultural values, and that I could see the problem that was potentially about to arise.
It's really, Bob, you've lighted on an incredibly difficult question here. Thank you for your call. It's a really good question. Kelsey, I noticed that, because I can see, because we're doing this by the magic of Zoom or Skype or whatever, I could see your eyebrows rise during the call. Your thoughts on that? The idea of, I don't know, what would you call it? Assimilation? Would that be too strong?
Sure. I mean, there's been debates for years, I think now, especially in Europe, about that issue, about the idea of assimilation versus accommodation, these different sort of ways of bringing new people into a society. And I think that this, it's an issue that hasn't been resolved or addressed in a way that I think a lot of inhabitants of those receptive societies, or, the society welcoming newcomers, would like to see. And I'm just curious if maybe Bob could tell me what he sees as the cultural, what kind of cultural clashes he was witnessing or observing for newcomers.
Am I allowed to?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so, I have no bias. I'm not trying to be offensive here, but I really was quite surprised when I was teaching in Sweden. They have something called sambo, which means you have the same rights as a married couple when you're not even married. And I remember teaching people Swedish language, and there being quite some shock that men and women could mix so freely. I had to explain gender, just gender non-binary people.
Yeah, just Bob, very quickly, who was it that you were teaching?
Well, I don't want to pinprick people, but it was people from Syria, obviously, and their religion seemed very... I was quite surprised that they enjoyed liberalism and freedom and right of expression in the most accepting country when it came to accepting them into Europe, but then they weren't necessarily willing to share communal swimming pools, which isn't a big deal in Sweden, or understanding that men and women are equal. And I just found that quite a shock, because I always assumed that everyone thought like this, and especially if you're going to come to Europe, that you would be on board with that. And I'm not trying to be offensive to them, because I know that they don't...
Well, these are great questions. I think, everyone has all sorts of assumptions about what other cultures will look like. I, for example, coming to Scandinavia, was interested or surprised by shared nude saunas, for example, as an American. I guess that's rude. So everyone's going to have expectations or assumptions from their own culture that they're going to bring to new experiences. And I just think it's important to be vocal about that and to share that. If you're talking about, for example, you were in a classroom, I think that's a perfect environment to have this learning process occur, and people can ask questions. Of course, people coming from different cultures are going to be interested or shocked maybe by new experiences and new expectations. And I think it's just a learning process and something we're going to go through.
The difficulty being, though, if there is a real culture clash, if there's a real issue about, I can't remember what word you described, that was one down perhaps from assimilation.
Accommodation.
Yeah, accommodation. If there is a... because there might be pockets of various communities in the UK or in Europe or in America, wherever, that just for whatever reason, religious, cultural, historical, don't accept that men and women are equal or everyone deserves equal opportunities. And that creates massive social tension.
Absolutely. And you're right. You see this, whether we're talking about France, the UK, the US,
France
Canada.
in particular, actually. Yeah, France in particular.
Yeah. Because France has quite a strict policy about, what they call laicité, which secularism, effectively, right? So that this can present problems to those who might not see that as the ideal way of existing in society or living. And I think you're right; it can create clashes, but I don't think it has to be confrontational. I think that generally the types of models that work best are those that are a bit more accommodating. Those make allowances. But I think, of course, it is natural when someone is coming to a new country to expect them to at least learn sort of, I don't want to say values, because I think that gets thrown around a lot. And I think that has sort of, at least in the U.S. context, these sort of inclinations of sort of propaganda or, what is our culture? And there's, of course, we're many, many cultures in this country and in all countries that are under discussion.
Yeah,
but I think there are... Yeah, I think that there are better ways about facilitating that type of integration, and others that are going to cause more confrontational outcomes, like as you might see in France.
But I think there is, though, certainly I think in Britain, there's an expectation of ideas, of values, of behaviour too, that might go hand in hand with that. But that is a whole other hour, I suspect, Kelsey. Bob, great question, thank you, and good insight as well. Joe's in Bromley. Joe.
Hi. I'm just a bit perplexed, really, as to what this thing is about anti-immigration. I'm a retired old boy. I'm in my 60s, nearly 70, and I was born to it. I knew it all my life. I mixed with the Serbo-Croats, the Polacks, the Latvians. America, the once great state, was born on immigration. It was founded by immigration. It was built and grown on immigration. immigration is a great thing.
Yeah. But Joe, I don't know that people are against. If people are against immigration, they're mad. What people desire is a control on an understanding of how and who and when it comes to immigration. Kelsey.
Yes, I don't think that he's wrong, though, at least in the current context, the current political context,
sure.
And especially in the United States, but I guess lots of other places as well. I think there is a really anti-immigrant stance, this idea that, we're full, we can't accept anyone else, we're good, we don't want other people coming to this country. And I think as our caller alluded to, this is it completely against the history of any sort of modern nation state. Any country has a lot of immigration, especially countries like the U.S., like Canada, others that are effectively settler colonial societies. Yeah. But I think that immigration is a critical part of any country, and it needs to be a critical part of any country, especially developed countries, because their populations are flatlining, right? Like they need immigration in order to keep building.
That's a really good point. It's a really good point on populations within certain Western countries. I think Japan in particular. But Joe, listen, thank you very much. Now I've got to squeeze a couple of things in. So Maya in Tottenham, you're going to have to be very, very quick, I'm afraid. Maya, hi.
Hi, you mentioned two nations. You mentioned Indonesia and Bangladesh.
Yes.
That they're suffering climate change. What about the population increase there? What about birth control there? The fact that they do have a high population because of their birth rate. And when, let's say, when they do move to the West, if you were to, let's say, look at the Bangladeshis of Tower Hamlets, they are known, if you look at the Home Office census, for having a high birth rate. Mm-hmm. So does that not add to climate change and strain on the Earth's resources?
Sure. I mean, if you look globally, though, most of the countries that are contributing the most to climate change issues, to emissions, are global north countries, right? They're not countries of the global south, where even though there might be sort of a more rapidly expanding population, those countries are not the main contributors to climate change. So I think if a large family were to move from the global south to the global north, their consumption rates in the global north would be more impactful for climate change than if they were to remain at home. So that is true. But I don't think that overpopulation, if that's what you're referencing in the global south context, is actually going to pose the greatest threat for climate change.
But certainly birth control in the global south is something that people are looking very hard into.
Sure. But I mean, it's not to say it doesn't exist. I think that the better way to sort of help that along maybe would be better further educational resources, access to it, right?
Mayor, it's a great question. Listen, apologies to John, to Anthony, to Ahmed, to people who couldn't get on tonight. Kelsey, I've got to ask you the final question that I ask every guest who appears on The Home of the Future, which is, what is the change that you think is coming in the next 10, 20, 25 years to make the issue of migration either less politically toxic or to make life easier for everybody, or the greatest change that is going to see the most progress made?
You ask a big one at the end there.
Oh, yeah. Leave the best for last.
So I do think that I think that this is a bit pessimistic, and I'm sorry, but I think that countries of the global north are going to continue to try to restrict as much migration as possible. I think that is the reality. And I think countries in the global south are actually becoming much more savvy about how they manage migration, because that south-to-south migration accounts for about half of the world's migration. So we're seeing a lot of people move between countries of the global south. Think about countries in Asia that have rapidly developed and are, destination points now for immigrants. So I think that actually a lot of the interesting immigration stories and phenomena will shift a bit more to people going between global south countries. And I think this, maybe it's a bit less politically toxic there, and maybe we'll see more positive immigration stories come out of that.
Great to talk to you. So generous of you to give us your time tonight. Thank you so much. Kelsey Norman, Director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Program at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Texas. The book is called Reluctant Reception. Go and check it out if you can. Thank you so much for your time tonight and throughout the course of the week.